Father wept as he held on to Aegon, his weeping weakened his stance. Remember me, and remember my story well, my son. Never try to be a great king. Be only a good king. I may pass on, but I will watch over you as you wed Lyanna and as you rule together and raise your children together. I love you, Aegon. So much, he said as held on to Aegon just to stand up. I love you too, father. Aegon awoke, surprised by the dream. He looked around for his bedside water jug. Seeing it, he sat up and poured himself a cup. As he drank from it, he looked in surprise at something familiar. What in the seven hells? It was the toy dragon father showed him in his dream. He reached for it and touched it. As he held it, he felt a warm presence on his hand. It felt as though another hand was holding his hand. I love you too, father, he whispered. On the morn, he heard the bells ring from the great September of Baelor. He was dressed by servants and looked at himself as he wore the colors of House Targaryen on his doublet. The great red three-headed dragon on his black doublet. By this day's end, I will be king and wed to Lyanna. I have prayed for the latter for as long as I can remember. Whilst I have wanted House Targaryen to be restored to what it once was, I never saw myself as king. At least, not this soon. Aegon was ridden to the steps of the Great September, escorted by Sir Perwyn and Sir Daemon. Gods, Aegon muttered as he felt the sunshine on his face. Is the climate not to your liking, your grace? Asked Sir Daemon with a grin, as though he was used to far warmer climates than this. Not quite, Sir Daemon. I am too used to the cold winter evenings and wet summer days of Winterfell. Even now, Winterfell still feels like home, Aegon admitted. Home is always where we feel our happiest, your grace. Where we feel accepted and where we know that when we have left for a while, that when we return, there is always our friends and family whom will welcome us with loving arms and tell us how much they missed us. You will always have that in Winterfell and now in King's Landing, said Sir Perwyn. Very wisely put, Sir Perwyn, said Aegon with a nod. Yes, very. Sir. Do you know this from experience? Asked Sir Daemon. Yes, since joining the Kingsguard. The twins was never home, with my brothers and cousins all fighting over whom was father's favorite, he replied with an amused grin. Gods, the tales they tell of House Free of the Crossing, they would make an amusing mummers show. They escorted him up the steps of the Great September, where High Septon Timion awaited them. It had taken a lot of negotiating with the High Septon to assure him that his children with Lyanna would be raised in the faith of the Seven, in spite of both he and Lyanna holding faith with the old gods. Mother can help me learn about the Seven, Aegon thought as he looked around at his family began to stand on his side and the Starks stood on the other. The bells finally began to slow their ringing when the footsteps leading to the top of the Great September began to quieten down. Quieten until he could hear only 3 sets of footsteps. One were a man's footsteps in leather boots. The second was a man in armor. And the third was the gentle footsteps of a woman. Aegon inhaled heavily before he turned around and caught sight of her, being escorted by her father on one side and by Brandon on the other side. There was absolutely no way I would not have fallen in love with her, Aegon surmised as he exhaled softly and slowly as he stared at his bride walking down the aisle toward him, beaming at him. Uncle Ned escorted Lyanna to his side. Aegon nervously could see his hand shake slightly before Lyanna held his hand. She beamed at him as he realized his hand no longer shook. I love you so much, Lyanna Stark. They held hands as the High Septon turned to them. You may bring the bride under your protection, said the High Septon. It's okay, Aegon, Lyanna whispered as Aegon unclasped his Targaryen cloak. Thank you, he whispered in reply with a smile. As he personally clasped his Targaryen cloak around her, the High Septon spoke aloud with a soft voice. My lords, my ladies. We stand here in the sight of gods and men to witness the union of husband and wife. One flesh, one heart, one soul, now and forever. And as they held hands, he tied a ribbon around their holding hands and said, let it be known that Aegon Targaryen and Lyanna Stark are one heart, one flesh, one soul. Cursed be he who would seek to tear them asunder. As they held hands, Aegon turned to Lyanna, whom smiled reassuringly at him. I would never ever want to wed anyone else. I love her so much, she just makes me so happy and reminds me that the world is not such a terrible place. Aegon's mind was returned to the wedding as the High Septon untied and unraveled the ribbon. Once completed, the High Septon raised his soft voice to loudly announce to all the gathered guests in the sight of the seven, I hereby seal these two souls, binding them as one for eternity. Look upon each other and say the words. Father, smith, warrior, mother, maiden, crone, stranger, they said together. I am hers and she is mine. From this day, until the end of my days, said Egon, nervously smiling at her, shy at all of the people behind him. I am his and he is mine. From this day, until the end of my days, said Elayna. With this kiss, I pledge my love, said Egon before he turned to her. Egon leant in shyly before kissing her lips. Just by kissing her, he no longer felt afraid of all the people and how all eyes were on he and his bride. He smiled shyly when he saw Rhaenys, mother and Aunt Daenerys looking at him with pride. But that was merely the first part of the ceremony. With the wedding over, now they were to be coronated. 2 Septons arrived with the Targaryen queen's crown, which had been recovered from the tomb of Grandmother Rhaella, and the crown of Aegon the Conqueror. Aegon, of House Targaryen, do you vow to serve the realm as its servant and never use your throne and crown for your own personal gain? I do. And to listen to all of your subjects, from commoners to nobles, and to guide them through times of poverty and times of prosperity? I do. Do you promise to teach your children these very things, that they may teach theirs and serve the realm and its people? I do. To do so from this day until your last? I do. Then, rise as Aegon of House Targaryen, 6th of your name, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms and Protector of the realm, and be greeted by your subjects, your grace, he said before turning to Elayna. Arise, Queen Elayna, and stand by your king in times of peace and prosperity, strife and hardship, said the High Septon. Aegon rose after both he and Elayna were crowned by the High Septon and they held hands. I will always be by your side, Aegon. I promise. I love you, she whispered. I love you too, he said as he tightened his grip on her hand. Chapter 69, The Bells No Longer Ring. Chapter text. Interlude XXXIII, Richard the Leonhardt in Heroes and Villains, thetvdb.com. Jon Connington, Steve Waddington. It had been 4 days since Aegon and Elayna were wed and crowned king and queen, and now Jon arrived at Rhaegar's tomb in the Great September of Baelor. Jon looked at the inscription that had replaced the one Robert the Usurper had put up in the rebellion's aftermath. Hello, old friend, he whispered. Jon brushed his hand on the image of his face. Gods, the cover didn't do you justice. You were far more handsome than this. Handsome, strong, skilled, kind, diligent and loved by many. You had so much potential and could have been one of the greatest kings of all. You were taken from us too soon. Jon remembered when he had been exiled after the Battle of the Bells. Exiled after failing to kill Robert Baratheon and being defeated by the combined armies of Robert Baratheon, Eddard Stark, Jon Arryn and Hoster Tully. He had been exiled by King Aerys. And it was as he arrived in Pentos, that he had heard the news of the killing of his childhood friend and the man he had been in love with for years. Jon had felt so helpless as he heard of how Robert had attempted to murder Rhaegar's family until they had been saved by Eddard Stark. Of how Robert had stolen lands of House Connington, gifted them to neighboring houses, reduced the great and noble House Connington of Griffin's Roost from a lordly house and one of the most powerful of the Stormlands to a mere knightly house. His failures haunted him to the extent that he would hear bells ringing in his head, just as they had rung in Stony September. But now, it was all over. Since returning to Westeros after years in the Golden Company, he had seen Rhaegar's son, heard about him from the small folk of Winterfell and seen what sort of a man he had been raised to be by Elia and his foster parents, Eddard and Ashera Stark. There had been a time when he had hated Eddard Stark during the rebellion. But when he learned that it was he and he alone whom protected them from Robert the Usurper, he respected him and was grateful to him, for saving Rhaegar's children and the last hope of House Targaryen. His cause was just against Aerys, but Rhaegar, gods, I wish you didn't let the prophecy consume you. Jon looked at Rhaegar's tomb one last time. I kept my promise, Rhaegar. He is king, as I promised. And I vow to be at his side and help him as Hand of the King, Jon whispered before stroking the image of Rhaegar's face one last time. He walked upstairs where he saw Harry Strickland, whom King Aegon had rewarded with the lordship of Dunstanbury after his family had been exiled by House Targaryen for fighting under Daemon Blackfyr in the First Blackfyr Rebellion. Lord Strickland John greeted. "My Lord Hand," said Harry with a grin as he said it. "When do you go to your new home?" asked John. "Soon. Now that the company is disbanded, many are going there with me to settle," he said. Now that the Golden Company had fulfilled its purpose in restoring a dragon to the Iron Throne, though Targaryen not Blackfyr, the Golden Company had disbanded. "And the rest?" asked John. "Have taken up residence in the city. Brynden the Blackfish has told me that the Dragon Pit shall soon be converted into a barracks for the Royal Army, and many of the company have decided to join it," he explained. "I wish you luck as Lord of Dunstanbury," Lord Strickland said John as he shook hands with him. "And I wish you the same as Hand of the King, old friend," replied Harry with a grin before he walked away. As John walked back to the Red Keep, he thought of the King and the Queen. Aegon will be a good king, with advisors such as myself, Elia, and with a queen such as Lyanna at his side. She is not some power-obsessed bitch such as Cersei Lannister or Margaery Tyrell. She is like her good mother or Queen Rulla, and cares for small folk and is a charitable woman. She will be a good queen, and they both will be a fine example to their children to live up to." As John walked to the Red Keep, he saw dozens of noble families leaving for their homes across the realm, including his own house, his late cousin's son Ronnet. After the rebellion, Jon's cousin Ronald had been named Knight of Griffin's Roost, whilst nearly 9/10 of their land had been stolen by their neighbouring houses. At the siege of Highgarden, Ronald had killed Alistair Florent before he was backstabbed by a knight of House Florent. And now Ronnet, whom had reproved the loyalty of House Connington to House Targaryen, had been elevated as Lord of Griffin's Roost, and more than half of the lands that once belonged to House Connington were returned. Houses Connington, Templeton, Selmy, Santager, Dalt, Tallheart and Glover had been elevated to lordly status by the King's decree for the loyalty and courage of its members shown during the war. Though as John looked at the Tyrells, whom had been left to marry their daughter, Margaery, to Edmure Tully, John snorted. They dare to try and ingratiate themselves with the King and entice him to wed Margaery Tyrell, when they were not loyal when it mattered. Houses Stark, Tully, Arryn and Baratheon were disloyal in the rebellion, but they all fought to restore House Targaryen to its rightful place alongside House Martell, all whilst the Tyrells dared to starve Storm's End and lazily wait out the war to end and see whom would prevail, and in this war, they tried to wed Margaery Tyrell to whomever they thought would be king. First Fortis Baratheon, then Joffrey the Ill-Born, and only 10 days ago, the one true king. Absolutely disgraceful. Montford Valerian is right, we should have given the wardenship of the south to the High Towers. Though, Algada's Baratheons' crushing of their armies should be a humbling lesson for them, that the Stormlanders are a force to always be reckoned with. Robert Baratheon was an embarrassment to his parents, to House Baratheon and to the Stormlands. But Algada's, a warrior without equal, he is the exact sort of a lord all Stormlands nobles should aspire to be like. And Fortis seems to a sensible lad, so long as he doesn't become like his uncle Robert. As John walked to the Great Council, he felt proud of all he had done since returning to Westeros from his exile. But also, he felt at peace with himself for the first time in a long time. And now, the bells in his head no longer rang. "My Lord Hand." John turned around and saw Sir Tymond approach him. "The King and Queen summon you to the King's Solar." "Thank you." "Let us go then, Sir Tymond," he replied. "Duty calls." John walked with Sir Tymond to the King's Solar. Looking at one of the many bastards of Robert Baratheon, John couldn't help but notice the similarities between he and his father. But whilst he had the hair and eye colour of the Baratheons, his face was comely, fair and elegant, like that of Jaime Lannister. Perhaps his mother or maternal grandfather was a Lannister. Tytos Lannister did favour the company of whores, after all. They arrived at the King's Solar, where Sir Tolas Waters and Sir Lucas Blackwood vigilantly stood guard. Sir Tolas knocked on the door. "My king, my queen. Lord Hand Connington is here at your request." "Bid him inside, Sir Tolas," said Queen Lyanna. Sir Tolas opened the door, and as Sir Tymond left, John entered the Solar, where the king and queen looked up at him. "My king." "My queen," said John, bowing his head to them both. "Lord Hand, we require a list compiled of all castles in a ruined state across the realm and whether they can be restored and the lands around them are suitable for settlers to take up residency," said King Aegon. "You intend to create lordships across the realm, your grace?" asked John. "I do." and for them to either be awarded to other sons we may have or for any other sons a lord paramount may have, he replied. Should be a long list, but can we afford such costs? Your Grace, forgive me, but is such a thing wise? Especially now when Lord Tyrion has paid off the last of the debts to the Iron Bank of Bravos, asked Jon. Lord Lannister assures me that we have 3 million gold dragons spare in the treasury, replied the king. The lords on whose lands these castles reside may demand compensation, Your Grace, said Jon. Of course, but for now, we will contemplate what castles you think are worthy for our consideration, Lord Hand, said Queen Elaena. Yes, my queen, said Jon, bowing his head and taking his leave. Willers X. Willers was glad that King Aegon had permitted for him to hold his wedding in the great September of Baelor. He was also glad that his family had all come for the wedding. The last time they had all been in the capital together, father, grandmother, mother and Margaery had all been frustrated that their attempts to ingratiate themselves with the king had been for naught when King Aegon married Lyanna Stark. But Willers didn't care for that. There will come a time when a Tyrell does become queen, but that is not today. For now, I am just glad that my family are safe and well after all the conflict with the Baratheons and Algedars wanted to ransack Highgarden, Willers thought as he remembered grandmother telling him of Algedar's threats of destroying Highgarden through disease. He had witnessed how brutal and ruthless the Stormborn was when he easily outfought Drold Dane and Lyn Corbray, two men reckoned to be amongst the finest fighters in Westeros. Garland had shielded Mother's Gaze and Loras shielded Margaery's when he had sliced the legs off of Lyn Corbray before finally killing him. And as he menacingly pointed at father in a threatening way, Willers was reminded of the almost prophetic words of Donal Noye. And as for Algedars, he is Valyrian steel. Beautiful to look at, but a mere mask for his capabilities. He's forever sharp, forever strong, forever dangerous, relentless and always leaves a mark wherever he goes, Willers remembered him say as he watched father shudder and sweat poured down his blanched skin. And he remembered just how he glared at them when the king negotiated a peace between them. After the slaying of Randil Tarly at the siege of Highgarden, Talar Tarlis' brother Sir Daikon, the new lord of Horn Hill, escorted her up the aisle to the altar, where Willers stood, leaning on his crutch. Willers looked at the row behind him and was glad to see all of his family and friends there, including Tyrion Lannister, whom he had befriended since coming to King's Landing, and his old friend, Oberyn Martell. Daikon smiled at his eldest sister before walking to the row behind her and standing with his mother and his other sisters. Willers smiled at Talar, whom smiled nervously back. Obviously I'm not at all gallant and chivalrous knight in shining armor, but I know I am good man, which is more than can be said for people such as Joffrey the Ill-Born. You may bring the bride under your protection, said His Holiness, the High Septon. He smiled again at her, hoping to try and put her at ease, as he unfastened his cloak, embroidered with the blooming golden rose of House Tyrell, and gently took off Talar's Tarly embroidered cloak and placed it aside and wrapped his Tyrell cloak around her. As the Tyrell cloak was fixed around her, His Holiness continued. My lords, my ladies. We stand here in the sight of gods and men to witness the union of husband and wife. One flesh, one heart, one soul, now and forever. And as they held hands, he tied a ribbon around their holding hands and said, let it be known that Willers Tyrell and Talar Tarly are one heart, one flesh, one soul. Cursed be he who would seek to tear them asunder. Willers leant in slightly to whisper to her. Talar, I know I am not what you expected in a husband, but I promise to always be good and to be kind to you. Thank you, she said nervously. Willers stood straight again as His Holiness untied and unraveled the ribbon. Once completed, His Holiness raised his voice for all to hear in the echoing great September in the sight of the seven, I hereby seal these two souls, binding them as one for eternity. He looked back down at Willers and at Talar. Look upon each other and say the words. Father, smith, warrior, mother, maiden, crone, stranger, they said together. I am hers and she is mine. From this day, until the end of my days, said Willers. I am his and he is mine. From this day, until the end of my days, said Talar. With this kiss, I pledge my love, said Willers. He leant in and gently kissed her. For the first time since Willers and his family had reunited in King's Landing, all were happy as they applauded and cheered for him. Chapter 70, A Sense of Closure. Chapter text. Algedars XXII. Algedars relaxed as he sat down in his old chambers in the Round Tower. Bellanora was sleeping in his old bed as Algirdas stood from his chair and walked to the window to look out at the sea. Once the feast is over, and we leave for Summerhall, it might be a long time before I return here to Storm's End. But here is my boyhood home, he thought. My love, are you all right? Algirdas turned around to his wife as she lay in bed, but looked up at him with a beaming smile. I should be the one asking you that, he said as he pulled up his chair beside the bed and sat down and held her hand. Are you well, he asked. I am. Will you bring Maester Cresson here? Of course I can, he said with a beaming smile. Algirdas stood up and let go of her hand before leaning down to kiss her forehead. I won't be long. Maester Cresson will see you soon, he said gently before leaving his chambers. Algirdas looked around and found Maester Cresson setting up his chambers for giving lessons to Fortis. It feels as though it were an entire century ago that I was receiving lessons from you in these very chambers, Maester Cresson, Algirdas said with a smile. Maester Cresson looked up and smiled as he saw him. You were never an easy pupil to teach, he commented. It is true, I paid more attention out on the training yard, Algirdas agreed. Maester Cresson smiled warmly, as though thinking back to memories of Algirdas' troublesome childhood. Was there something you needed, he asked. Yes, Bellanora asked if you could attend her, Algirdas replied. He nodded and said I'll come and see her in a moment. Maester Cresson's warm smile changed to a grimace. For many years, since the siege ended, I have prayed for you. That you would be happy and that you would find peace. Have you found peace? Algirdas inhaled briefly before exhaling in thought. Happiness and peace are different things. Happiness. Yes, I've found that with my wife and our soon-to-be-born child and in protecting my family. As for peace, I don't know if I have found peace within myself, he replied. Then find a way. He watched as he walked out of his solar and to Algirdas' chambers. Algirdas looked out to Shipwreck Bay. He walked down the numerous flights of staircases until he had left the round tower and walked to the cliff staircase, a stone staircase built into the rock, which led from the courtyard of the round tower to the harbour. Algirdas looked out at the waters and saw that they were calm. He looked up at the sky and saw that it was calm. In spite of summer long ended and that winter had come, Algirdas was glad that it was a calm day and that there was some sunshine and no rain. He paid a fisherman a silver stag to take him to Wind-Proud Rock. The fisherman rowed him to the rock, where Mother, Father and the crew of their ship, the Wind-Proud, had crashed during the storm when Mother had given birth to him. Algirdas looked at the rock and reached out from the boat, touching it. I could have died here. I would have died without the world knowing my name when Sir Courtenay braved the storm and the sea to rescue survivors. But then he looked at where he must have been recovered by Sir Courtenay when he had found Mother, dying. I hope I have made you both proud, Mother and Father. I know that I didn't protect them, my brothers. The sons you raised and the ones whom remembered you. But I protect your grandchildren now. I always will. Algirdas planted a kiss on the Wind-Proud Rock and then turned to the fisherman. Take us back to the harbour, he said. Yes, my lord, he replied. He couldn't take his eye off of the rock as they were rowed back to the harbour. Algirdas walked back up the cliff staircase and back to the courtyard of the round tower. He decided to find where his brothers rested. Algirdas found Doran's tree and the tombs of his brothers in the ossuary. He walked to find his brothers, all gathered together. Hello, my brothers, he whispered before he sat in front of them. I know how much you hated them, Robert, but how's Targaryen rule now? Better them than the Lannister monstrosity that dared to call himself a Baratheon. There is peace and stability in the realm now. And 2 of your bastard boys are in the Kingsguard. Tolas and Tymund. I hope you are proud of Tor Owen, I know I am. He was one of the bravest men I've ever met, he said with pride. Then he turned to Renly. I saved him, Renly. I found Loras on the battlefield, but saved him and spared him. He is a Kingsguard knight now. He misses you still and loves you still, Algirdas said as he remembered when he spoke to Tyrell when he was still his prisoner. He even had tried to join him in Littlefinger's trial of combat against Lyn Corbray and Drold Dane. But Algirdas had told him they are mine to kill. And finally, he turned to Stannis. I protected them, Stannis. I saved our home from the Reach and protected Shireen and Fortis from the Tyrells. My message was clear to all kingdoms, never make an enemy of the Stormlands or with House Baratheon. They have at last paid the price for all they have done. And by the 7, did they squirm when I merely glared at the scum? Half of them were screaming when I avenged both you and Renly. Who knows? Maybe you would have grinned at seeing them blanch and shudder, he said. He planted a kiss on each of their tombs, tears falling down his face as he did so. Now, I won't be joining you soon. I am Lord of Summerhall now, and have even taken up the name Durathian, combining the names Durandon and Baratheon. But, I know I will join you a while from now. I know you will all keep mother and father busy for the years to come before I join you all. But you be good to them until I join you all, and for the first time, we can all be a family. All 6 of us. I might finally meet mother and father. Algirdas fully cried as he forced himself to sit up and face their tombs. Algirdas calmed at last before he found the tomb of Tor Owen. He debated bitterly with Catelyn to have Tor Owen interned in the ossuary, stating that in spite of being a bastard, he had Baratheon blood. Catelyn angrily stated a bastard does not deserve to be buried in the ossuary alongside the Baratheons and Durandons of Storm's End. But then Shireen and Fortis intervened. He didn't die a sellsword. He died a hero of House Baratheon and the Stormlands. He deserves to be honored as such, stated Fortis, and it was he whom gave the order. You were every inch the warrior, Tor Owen. You may not have had my name of Baratheon, but you had the heart of a hero and the blood of a Baratheon. You had the heart and blood of the Baratheons and Durandons in you, alongside the iron fighting spirit of the Ironborn of old that made all of Westeros tremble at the sight of their sails, long ago. And you were my nephew. I am sorry I couldn't protect you that day at Highgarden, but I know that I was always proud of you and always be. Robin is captain of Storm Company now. Tolas and Tymond are in the Kingsguard. And soon, Edric, Gendry and Mark will come with me to Summerhall. But you are here, forever. Goodbye, my boy. Algirdas walked back to the Round Tower and saw Maester Cressen returning from Bellenora in Algirdas' chambers. How is she? Algirdas asked. She is well, my lord. I have given her some medicine until the feast. That should keep her content for a while. Thank you, Maester, he replied. Did you find what it was you were looking for, he wondered. I did. And now, I do feel at peace with myself, said Algirdas. Maester Cressen beamed before patting his shoulder. They would be proud of you, you know that. Robert. Stannis. Renly. Your father and your mother. Algirdas nodded with a smile as he thought of them. Robert. Stannis. Renly. Algirdas walked towards his chambers, until he heard the arrival of the various lords of the Stormlands. As they climbed down from their horses, he could suddenly see the courtyard bare except for the 4 sons of Steffon Baratheon and Cassina Estermont. He saw Robert at 19 dressed in riding leathers for returning to the Eyrie to resume his wardship under Jon Arryn. Stannis, at 17 newly knighted from his time as a squire under grandfather Gunthor Estermont, was teaching Renly and Algirdas how to fight. Renly at 7 was already good, but not skilled. But this was Algirdas' first lesson, having just turned 4. Algirdas felt tears in his eyes as he remembered this time. This had been the last time the 4 of them had been together, before Rhaegar had absconded with Lyanna Stark and taken her to Dorne. Before the Tyrells besieged and blockaded Highgarden. The last times when Algirdas was a happy boy, whom did not feel hatred towards any house or any country. My children will not grow up as I did. I never want them to be poisoned by hatred as I was. Though Mace Tyrell lives, we have our revenge on the fat fool. Highgarden still repairs and tries to heal what the Reach suffered from me. House Baratheon will renowned, feared and respected from all over the realm because of the fighting in this war. And best of all, Mace Tyrell's pretty little weed of a girl will never be queen. Algirdas smiled as he looked down at Fortis and Shireen welcoming the various lords of the Stormlands. He was proud of them. Shireen, the Storm Maiden, they called her. And Fortis, the young Storm. Whereas they called Algirdas the Storm's Fury. Uncle. Algirdas turned around to see Gendry, Mark, Edric and Robin. Lads. Are we all ready to leave on the morrow, he asked. We are, Uncle, Gendry confirmed. And are you ready, Robin? To lead Storm Company, asked Algirdas. Robin nodded as he drank from a jug of wine. I am, he said simply. Mark and Edric had agreed to leave the service of Storm Company whilst Robin had stayed on to become captain of Storm Company, telling Algerdus that he would take them by sea back to Myr and to Redhold. I'll miss the old life of adventuring across the known world and fighting battles and wars and against innumerable foes. But, I have done what I set out to do. Make enough coin to provide for Summerhall and see it rebuilt for it to be my home. And in doing so, brought justice to House Baratheon and restored glory and honor to the Baratheons of Storm's End. Algerdus, Bellinora and his 3 nephews were sat amongst the nobility of the Stormlands in the great feast in the Round Tower. Algerdus beamed proudly at Shireen and Fortis as they sat with their mother at the high table. Algerdus was proud of how the noblemen of the Stormlands and their sons all drank proudly and victoriously as they told each other's families of their deeds, whether true or over-exaggerated. Algerdus looked up from his plate and spotted Rutger Wensington looking at him from a side door. He nodded sharply once at him. Rutger nodded back and then went into the side door for a moment before re-entering the hall. Algerdus picked up his wine cup and banged it twice on his table. All turned to him as he stood up. My lords and ladies of the Stormlands. I would like to say that I am proud to have fought alongside many of you in the trying days of the war. But now that the war is over, I present a gift to all noble houses of the Stormlands, he said before gesturing to Rutger. Rutger bid the servants through the side door and they entered, bringing Algerdus gifts inside, all reforged from his looting in Meereen. All looked in shock at this display of weapons, long swords and bastard swords. These are all Valyrian steel swords. Forged from Valyrian steel ingots, collected from my adventures in Slaver's Bay. And they are my gift to you all, my lords, he proudly announced. Each servant handed a sword to each of the lords, who eyed their respective swords with pleasant surprise and joy as they held it up high. And lastly, I am proud to present mine own sword, Antler, to my beloved nephew, Fortis, he said as he unbuckled his sheathed sword and walked to Fortis as he remained sat down. Algerdus placed the sword down in front of his plate on the table. Thank you, uncle, said Fortis as he stood up and took up Antler. My honor, my lord, replied Algerdus before he leant down and hugged Fortis. Algerdus walked back to his chair as all the Stormlords toasted to Algerdus' good health and thanked him for the gifts. Yet another reason the other kingdoms south of the Neck shall look at the Stormlands with fear and respect. He raised his cup to Fortis and winked at him. I'll always be there for you, Fortis. As your uncle and as your bannerman. Chapter 71, Peace at Long Last. Chapter text. Garlan 9. Garlan was glad to be back home in Whitegrove and with Leonette safely there, having given birth to their child, a daughter, called Alysanne. When he had been released after Algerdus had agreed to King Aegon's orders, Garlan had her escorted back to Whitegrove. He didn't want her to be travelling as far as King's Landing when she was heavy with child. And he wanted her safely in Whitegrove and away from what Algerdus had reduced Highgarden to. And now, whilst in King's Landing, a raven had arrived, telling him that she had safely given birth to a daughter. As he rode through the gates of Whitegrove, he remembered when he and Loras had returned to Highgarden, wounded, but treated well enough in the custody in Algerdus and his army. Garlan had been wounded with a broken nose, a cut on his left wrist from when Algerdus' Valyrian steel axe had struck through his shield and his gauntlet, and a large wound on his shoulder when he had crushed his pauldron. Garlan had been glad to see father was alive and well, for he had feared for the worst when father's attempt to run had saved his life from Algerdus. As Garlan and Loras were brought to the courtyard of the palatial keep, mother stared in horror at the sight of them. Gods! My poor boys! What has he done to you? She asked as she ran up to them both, hugging them and kissing them. Mother, we're all right, Loras insisted. You're far from all right, she said as she looked at the wounds on his face. Loras was never in any danger, especially from Algerdus, Garlan thought as he remembered what Algerdus' reasoning for not killing him. He may hate all Tyrells, but I am glad that he knew how much Loras and Renly meant to each other and how much Loras loved Renly. Garlan was greeted inside by household soldiers as he climbed down from his horse. But as he looked around, he noticed how numerous women were working professions that many men would have worked. Professions such as those sweeping the courtyard, stable hands, blacksmith apprentices, butchers, bakers, carpenters and all menial jobs around the castle. The only men around were the guards and his household soldiers. Garlan frowned at the lack of men around. I had left Whitegrove with 2,500 men when the war began. Father had recruited an additional 500 when Algirdas besieged Highgarden. And now I return with less than 700 men, Garland thought with sadness. No good ever comes of war. Just suffering and death. There's no such thing as glory in war. Just the deaths of men, young and old. Those who live are never the same men they once were. And those whom die, leave behind wives and children with no one to care for them. Garland smiled when he saw Leonette stood before the doors to the keep. He climbed down from his horse and faced her. Leonette, he said before running to her. He hugged her and cried as he held her. Garland, it's all right, she said. No, it's not. You were in danger in Highgarden. You and Alysanne both, he said, not forgiving himself for not having her taken from Highgarden sooner. Listen to me, Garland. The war is over. It's all over. We're safe now. You. Me. And our little Alysanne, she said as she beckoned her handmaiden to come to her side. Garland looked up at the handmaiden and saw her hold their daughter in her arms. She is so adorable, Garland thought as he looked lovingly at her. Garland heard crying from behind him. He turned around to see dozens of women around the castle crying as some of Garland's soldiers told them of their losses. Fathers, sons, brothers, husbands, uncles, cousins, nephews and friends. Was this all worth it, Algirdas Baratheon? Was your revenge on father and House Tyrell worth the deaths of tens of thousands of good reachmen? Garland was glad to be back home and away from a future of another war. He had served as a squire in the Greyjoy Rebellion and hated seeing the fighting at Blacktide where father and Randyll Tarly fought, and hated seeing the dead Ironborn warriors lying around and seeing how Iron Island families spat and shouted hatred at their armies, which Garland sympathized for how they lost men of their families. Garland had promised to never fight in another war again and instead wanted to devote his life to his home, his family and to his people. Garland told Leonette of this promise before they welcomed mother and father to Whitegrove and introduced them to their first grandchild, to little Alysanne. Bellenora 9. Summerhall was magnificent. She's done such excellent work, Algirdas said as he stared at the magnificence of his home, built to this standard thanks to Shireen. And it is yours now, said Bellenora. No, my love. It is ours, he said with a beaming smile before he hugged her and kissed her. When I first came here, it was in a sorry state. I knew it had been in such a mess, all of the realm knew it. Robert must have known it when he awarded it to me. But, in his laziness for such mundane things such as this, he assumed that Littlefinger would foot all the costs, said Algirdas. Bellenora rubbed his back and put her arm over his shoulders when she saw how angry he became from just mentioning that man's name. She smiled reassuringly at him, at which he smiled back. Bellenora admired the banners that flew from the walls, the towers, the gatehouse and the battlements of the keep. There were 3 great banners flying tall from the keep. The first was the lowest standing one, of House Durathian, of a steel cuirass with a lightning bolt engraved on it and 5 arrows sticking out of it. The second stood taller, proudly bearing the banner of House Baratheon. And the third, stood the tallest, of House Targaryen. Storm Company had since left for Myr and for Redhold, under Robin's command. Algirdas, Mark and Edric had hugged him hard before he left Summerhall. You'll always be welcome here, my boy, said Algirdas, proud of his nephew. Several hundred men of Storm Company had chosen to settle down in Summerhall, many taking up professions as guardsmen or as household soldiers. Algirdas had named Mark as his guard captain and Edric as his master of arms. And the company blacksmith, Gendry, had been made castle blacksmith. Bellenora was happy at seeing how Algirdas had cared for all of his bastard nephews and nieces and ensured they were cared for in Summerhall. Bronn, whom also decided to settle down, wanted a lordship, and so Algirdas named him a bannerman of his own, giving him the lordship of a keep of Daeron's Acre, based at the border of Summerhall and House Caffan's seat of Thornton. Daeron's Acre had been built by Daeron II whilst he was having Summerhall built. And in the aftermath of the tragedy of Summerhall, Daeron's Acre had been used as a summer estate to replace Summerhall by the Targaryens until their downfall in Robert's rebellion. Bronn became Sir Bronn Melander, Knight of Daeron's Acre. Bellenora enjoyed living at Summerhall with Algirdas, and seeing a side of him that she had never seen before. She had previously feared that he would yearn for war and fighting again like his eldest brother Robert. But now, she enjoyed how he spent time going for rides around the lands of Summerhall and admiring his new family seat and all his sellsword earnings had built. And it was 2 moons after they had settled in Summerhall, as Lord Algerdus and Lady Bellenora of House Durathian of Summerhall, that Bellenora gave birth. Algerdus had returned from one of his rides around Summerhall as Bellenora gave birth to a son. Algerdus' eyes filled with tears as he held their son in his arms. "My son. My little boy," he managed to say. "My love, come," Bellenora whispered. He sat down on the bed next to where she lay. "What will we call him?" she wondered. Algerdus passed their son to her. As she rested his head on her arm and kissed his head, she admired his features. His skin was a mix of her dark skin and the brightness of Algerdus' pale skin, almost like a Valerian of Driftmark. And had inherited the beautiful dark blue eyes of his father. "Kaloyan," he said. "Kaloyan," she repeated. "Yes." Kaloyan was what the children of the forest called Durangotskreef, named for his stormy nature and where he had built his home of Storm's End, he explained. They looked down at Kaloyan, whom cooed and cried at the mention of the meaning behind his name. "Well, Kaloyan Durathian, what do you think of your name?" Algerdus asked. He cooed as he wriggled his tiny arms and legs around. Algerdus giggled and leant down and kissed his forehead. "You're a fine lad and will be a good man one day. I will always be by your side, my boy. I promise," he whispered before kissing his forehead again. He stood up again and kissed Bellenora. "We have a beautiful little boy," she said. "Yes, we do," agreed Algerdus. Chapter 72, History. Chapter Text. War has become a constant in the lives of all people of Westeros. From the age of heroes to present day, never had there been a period of more than 2 generations when there wasn't a conflict taking place in the 7 kingdoms of Westeros. Until the reign of King Aegon VI of House Targaryen. The life of King Aegon, known as Aegon the Ascending, was one full of tragedy. In the aftermath of the war which saw the overthrow of House Targaryen, it was only House Stark of Winterfell which stood up for what was left of the crippled, but alive dynasty. Bringing the Targaryens out of hiding, barring Queen Rolla, whom had died from a fever, Tywin Lannister suggested to the king of the new Baratheon dynasty for him to have them murdered, for the sake of peace. Robert's impatient demeanor, combined with his deep loathing for House Targaryen for being the cause of death of his former betrothed, Lyanna Stark, had made it easy for his future good father to convince. But in spite of all that his family had suffered due to House Targaryen, Eddard Stark unhesitatingly defended the remaining Targaryens, insisting that he would take them to Winterfell and raise the children as he would raise his own. The friendship between the 2 men had long gone when Robert went as far as calling Eddard Stark's lady wife a Dornish whore, at which Eddard unsheathed Stark's sword ice and threateningly pointed it at him, and shouting at all around him to face him. None would do so. And all accounts from that day in the Red Keep described the once quiet and reserved second son of Rickard Stark shout in fury at all whom intended to harm the Targaryen children or allow such a thing to occur, even demanding to know why he was a northern savage for not wanting to lay harm on children and demanded to know what that made the southerners, supposedly full of chivalry and honor. In the end, Robert relented, allowing Eddard Stark to return to Winterfell with Elia Martell, Daenerys, Rhaenys and Aegon Targaryen. Eddard Stark refused to serve on Robert's small council or see reason as Robert himself put it, and so isolated the north from the south, but maintaining an alliance with Dorne. Due to Robert Baratheon's threats towards Elia Martell and the young Targaryens, Dorne also isolated itself from the rest of the kingdoms, and it was from the marriage between Eddard Stark and Ashera Dayne that the alliance between Winterfell and Sunspear was born. An alliance which continues to this very day. As for Robert, though a great warrior and a fiery and inspiring presence on the battlefield, quickly showed he was not a capable king, administrator or ruler. He preferred hunting, feasting, drinking and whoring his kingdom into debt whilst his hand of the king, Jon Arryn, ruled the kingdoms on his behalf. After his brother Stannis' marriage to Catelyn Tully, Stannis was named Lord of Storm's End and Lord Paramount of the Stormlands, whilst Renly was named Lord of Dragonstone when he had come of age. Summerhall, once a summer estate for the Targaryens, was slowly being rebuilt as Robert was intent on gifting it to his youngest brother, Algerdus. Lord Steffon Baratheon, though died in a shipwreck on the rocks of Shipwreck Bay long before the rebellion's beginning, left a great legacy than he could ever have imagined in his 4 sons. His eldest, Robert, had become king after killing Crown Prince Rhaegar, crushing the great Targaryen dynasty and establishing the Baratheon dynasty. His second son, Stannis, was famed for holding Storm's End for a year and never yielding to the armies of House Tyrell. His third son, Renly, earned a reputation of gifting charity to the small folk of Dragonstone, Storm's End and King's Landing, and hosting grand feasts in his seat of Dragonstone. And lastly, Algerdus, who left the greatest legacy of them all, and whose name lives on as Algerdus Stormborn or Algerdus the Storm's Fury. But any hopes that this new dynasty would be greater than the Targaryens was dispelled with Robert's mismanagement of the realm's finances for his personal pleasures. In spite of defeating the Iron Islands in a rebellion for independence led by Balon Greyjoy, Robert had devolved from a strong and mighty warrior into a largely overweight and drunkard of a man. Eddard Stark had meanwhile built the north to great effect by building the Cailin Canal, restoring castles such as Moat Cailin and Wolf's Den, building new ones such as Snowhelm, and then leading a war against the Wildling armies from beyond the wall. The war fought beyond the wall is shrouded in mystery, and very few, if any, speak of the war. Some have claimed that the armies of the north, the armies of Wildlings and the Night's Watch, put aside all differences to fight the resurrected army of the dead intent on bringing the Long Night, and that it was Aegon Targaryen himself whom slew the leader, the fabled Night King. Eddard Stark enforced the subjugation of the Wildlings and annexed the lands beyond the wall, and building towns, settlements and castles on the coastal regions beyond the wall, as well as discovering a cache of Valyrian steel in the ruins of the first keep of Winterfell. This Valyrian steel was reforged into weapons and gifted to the bannermen of the north, and Eddard Stark kept a few on hand to give to his nephew Jon Rostock and his sons Ulrich and Rickon, when they were named lords of Snowhelm, Moat Cailin and Wolf's Den respectively. With the Wildlings integrated with the north and no enemy to fight, the Night's Watch, under Eddard Stark's suggestion, was decreed to have a presence in all kingdoms of Westeros and serve to fight all criminals, broken men and pirates of the realm. Whilst King Robert agreed to this, in a paranoid fit, he demanded for Rhaenys Targaryen to wed Eddard Stark's eldest son and heir Artos, and for Daenerys Targaryen to wed Jon Arryn's only son and heir, Harold. The Targaryens Aegon, Rhaenys and Daenerys had grown up alongside the children of Eddard Stark, Artos, Lyanna, Brandon, Deanna, Ulrich, Serena, Arya and Rickon, his bastard nephew Jon Snow, whom became Jon Rostock, and his ward Theon Greyjoy. The princesses had grown into beautiful and clever women, educated by Elia Martell and their foster mother Ashera Stark. Aegon, whilst quiet and reclusive like his foster father, he grew to become a great warrior, and whilst fighting beyond the wall, took up the long-lost Targaryen swords Blackfyr and Dark Sister, finding them amongst the remains of Bryndon Rivers in a cave beyond the wall. Whilst Rhaenys Targaryen was wed to Artos Stark and did give birth to a son, named Rickard, Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, died under mysterious circumstances. Not wanting to name either of his brothers or his good father as Hand of the King, King Robert decided to name his former friend Eddard Stark as his Hand, in the hopes of restoring the long-lost friendship between the two, as well as betrothing his son, Crown Prince Joffrey, to Eddard Stark's eldest daughter, Lyanna. Lyanna Stark was a famed beauty of the north, taking after her mother, and was referred to as the Star of the North. Indeed, her hand in marriage had been sought by many suitors, such as Harrison Karstark, Jon Umber, Darin Hornwood, Roderick Forrester and Clesa Wynn. Eddard Stark accepted to serve as Hand only for a year, for he was reluctant to stay in the capital where so many of his family had died, and in a dishonorable place where the Game of Thrones is played by the many ambitious and dishonorable nobles of the realm. Leaving his son Artos to rule in his stead, Eddard Stark went south with his wife Ashera, and their daughters Lyanna and Arya, and their second son Brandon, whom was intent on becoming a knight of the Kingsguard. But whilst in King's Landing, Eddard Stark had discovered that Jon Arryn had indeed been murdered, for what he suspected involved the Lannisters in the capital. He learned that Robert Baratheon had many bastards across the capital, and upon meeting them, saw the resemblance they had to their father, whilst the royal children bore no resemblance whatsoever, looking more like their Lannister mother. He soon realized that they were in actual fact bastard children born of incest between Cersei Lannister and her brother, Jaime Lannister the Kingslayer. Meanwhile, across the narrow sea in Pentos, Robert Baratheon's enemy, Viserys Targaryen, had confronted the brother of his hated enemy, Algerdus. Algerdus, whom was eager to both make enough coin for his new home of Summerhall and to earn glory by fighting in wars across the world, formed a sellsword company, named Storm Company. He had formed Storm Company with some of the bastard sons of Robert Baratheon, his nephews Robin Waters, Tymond Hill, Tolars Waters, Torwin Pike, Mark Rivers and Edric Storm. They had won 2 great victories for Pentos against their rival Bravos. But at a victory feast, Viserys confronted Algirdas. Algirdas was challenged to a duel and Viserys charged him with a sword, whilst Algirdas stabbed him in the belly, with a dining fork. One of the 4 last claimants of House Targaryen was dead. But Algirdas' ambition didn't stop there. He fought in numerous other wars across Essos, for Volantis against an enormous horde of Dothraki, where his nephew Tolar's Waters bravely slew the nefarious Khal Drogo. And for Dorne, Storm Company helped crush the pirates of the Stepstones and helped conquer the Stepstones for Dorne. Before their greatest contract came when Jaehaerys Varlinaron hired them to conquer the cities of Slavers Bay, that he might carve a kingdom for himself. Upon uncovering the truth of the heritage of the royal children, Eddard and Ashara Stark plotted to reveal the truth to King Robert, but the Lannisters were already ahead of him, and had poisoned his wine as he hunted, where he felled a great wild boar, but in doing so, was mortally wounded. Robert's younger brothers, Stannis and Renly, plotted for Stannis' son, Fortis, to be crowned king and for him to wed Margaery Tyrell, reputedly one of the most beautiful women in the realm, to gain the forces of the Reach, in spite of the hatred for House Tyrell and the Reach Stannis and Algirdas held. Algirdas' hatred for House Tyrell was famous to the extent that he refused to drink even a drop of Arbor Gold. Renly, on the other hand, was close friends with his former squire, Sir Loras of House Tyrell, the 3rd son of the Lord of Highgarden. King Robert died from his wounds and within the hour of his death, the Lannisters had already crowned Joffrey Waters the king. Eddard and Ashara Stark, refusing to bow to a false king, escaped King's Landing with their family, as well as the Kingsguard knights, Arthur Dayne, Barristan Selmy and Oswell Went, whilst Gerald Hightower fought to the death against the Lannister soldiers to give them time to escape. The 4 former knights whom had served House Targaryen had sworn an oath to the 7 to restore the rightful heir to the Iron Throne when the time was right. And so, the runaway Starks and their Kingsguard protectors had fled to Riverrun, where they were friends of House Tully, in spite of Hoster Tully's unsuccessful attempts to convince Eddard Stark in Robert's rebellion to wed his daughter Catelyn Tully and divorce Ashara Dayne. War began when Tywin Lannister and Jaime Lannister marched the armies of the Westerlands to the Riverlands for harbouring enemies and traitors to the crown. They occupied many castles and towns of the Riverlands from Pink Maiden to Harrenhal, threatening the gates of Castle Deary. All while the armies of the North and the Vale marched on the Riverlands in response to the invasion. The Vale marched because of Harold Arryn's mother being the 2nd daughter of the now dying Hoster Tully and brother to his heir, Edmure Tully. The remnants of the Riverlands army, beaten at the Golden Tooth, were forced to meet with the army of the twins and join the army of the North as they marched to meet the Vale army at the newly built keep of Moon's Keep. And it was Artos Stark whom planned to trick the Lannister armies. His plan was, for the renowned Sir Brynden Tully the Blackfish to lead an army of 15,000 to distract Tywin Lannister at the Green Ford. Distract him long enough for an army led by Roose Bolton and Yohn Royce to lead another army to liberate Harrenhal, an army led by Harold Arryn to save Castle Deary from besiegement and for Artos Stark to lead the rest to Riverrun and save it from the besiegement of Jaime Lannister and his army of 30,000. Aegon Targaryen fought bravely at the Battle of the Green Ford, where he had killed Sir Laurent Lorque, coincidentally the cousin of one of Tywin Lannister's bannermen whom attempted to assassinate he and his family. And it was at the Green Ford where Tywin Lannister had lost less than 5,000 men before Sir Brynden retreated. At Harrenhal, after crushing a patrol of cavalry, Roose Bolton commanded for their army to attack at the main gate before other forces attacked from the other undefended gates, liberating the greatest castle in Westeros. At Castle Deary, Harold Arryn lured out a small force of the besieging army before they were ambushed and the camp came under attack from all sides. And at the Battle of the Whispering Wood, Sir Patrek Malistell lured out the impatient and bored Kingslayer, tricking him into thinking that he led a skirmishing force, which the Kingslayer responded to with all of his cavalry. They chased him into a wood called the Whispering Wood and there they were ambushed Artos Stark and his cavalry, and was where the heir to Winterfell duelled and defeated Jaime Lannister. With the defeat of the Lannister cavalry, the Northern army surrounded and crushed the unprepared Lannister army beneath the walls of Riverrun. Tywin Lannister, realizing that the Riverlands was lost, marched what was left of his army to Duskendale. The victorious armies of the Riverlands, the Vale and the North regrouped at Riverrun, and it was there that all nobility unanimously swore fealty to Aegon Targaryen and swore to fight to restore him to the Iron Throne. King Aegon accepted their oaths of fealty and wrote to his uncle Doran, Prince of Sunspear, for him to send help. Unbeknownst to he, help was already on the way, for the Golden Company, led by the exiled John Conington, returned to Westeros for the first time since the War of the Ninepenny Kings. The Golden Company swore allegiance to King Aegon and to restore him to the Iron Throne. Whilst the armies of the Vale, led by Harold Arryn, marched to intercept an army marching for Duskendale. The army was made up of banners of the Crown Lands and led by Sir Barman Byrch. And the Riverlands army, led by Edmure Tully, guarded the road to the Riverlands. Aegon felt that as soon as Tywin's strength was replenished, he would march for the Riverlands again. But now he could do nothing when King Aegon dispatched the Northern Army and the Golden Company to invade the Westerlands and crush the army of reinforcements at Oxcross, led by Stafford Lannister. At the Battle of Brindlewood, the Vale army lured the Crown Lands army of Barman Byrch into a trap. And as they fell into the trap, from all sides, the mighty knights of the Vale fell upon them, crushing the army, and Barman Byrch was slain by Lord Yone of House Royce. Whilst Eddard Stark returned home to Winterfell to bring his wife and daughter Lyanna to safety before he returned to the war, Artos Stark, now a proven warrior and battle commander, led the Northern Army alongside John Conington leading the Golden Company. But whilst further war was brewing in the central kingdoms of the realm, in the southern kingdoms the war was just beginning. Stannis and Renly Baratheon led a party to Starpike, seat of House Peak, where they were to meet the Tyrells and discuss their alliance to crown Fortis Baratheon king and for Margaery Tyrell to be queen. Whilst Stannis was very reluctant to meet with the Tyrells and his hatred for them was known, it was Renly whom was close to the Tyrells. Renly kept a close friendship with Sir Loras Tyrell, the Knight of the Flowers, and third son of Mace Tyrell. But soon upon riding into the lands of House Caron of Nightsong, they were ambushed. Renly and Stannis were both murdered by two very skilled knights, as witnessed by Lord Bryce Caron of Nightsong. Lord Caron escaped the ambush and sent his bastard brother Roland to Nightsong with the remainder of the party, whilst he personally brought the news to Stannis' lady wife Catelyn and their children, Shireen and Fortis. The Tyrells discovered the scene of the ambush and the murderers were long gone by the time of their arrival. But when they found the bodies of Stannis and Renly, they found them wrapped in flags of House Targaryen. In Highgarden, soon after the ambush, the Tyrells received the Master of Coin, Lord Petter of House Baelish. Lord Baelish was a man of very ill repute, and as well as owning brothels in King's Landing, he allegedly purchased the allegiance of the gold cloaks of King's Landing and ensured his puppets were in command. Lord Baelish brought a message from Tyrion Lannister, the dwarf son of Tywin Lannister, and Joffrey the Ill-born's hand of the king. The offer was for Margaery Tyrell to wed Joffrey and for the Tyrell armies to join with the Lannister armies fighting the armies of the North, Riverlands and Vale. The Tyrells accepted. On why they accepted, is the subject for debate still. Some claim it was a matter of honor for Margaery Tyrell to be wed to a Baratheon claimant to the Iron Throne. Others say it was a power play by Mace Tyrell for his daughter to be queen. But whatever the case, House Tyrell forgot its debt to House Targaryen. The debt being that it was Aegon the Conqueror whom conquered the Reach and destroyed the ruling House Gardener and gave the lordship of Highgarden and wardenship of the South to the Tyrells. And yet, when the war started for House Targaryen to be restored to the Iron Throne, House Tyrell and its bannermen did not fight for House Targaryen, but for its enemies. In the Westerlands, as they reached the Golden Tooth, guarding the pass into the heartland of the Westerlands, it was the direwolf pets of the children of Eddard Stark which changed the war. They sniffed at the ground and discovered a hidden goat path which led across the mountains and onto the other side of the Golden Tooth. Knowing that they couldn't idle for long if they wanted to retain the element of surprise, Artos Stark and John Conington led the cavalry of the North and the Golden Company to cross into the Westerlands and attack the army of Stafford Lannister, whilst Lord Meager Sewin and Sir Rolly Duckfield commanded the infantry of both armies to march for Lannisport. Their ultimate plan was to capture a large port of the Westerlands, and they had ultimately decided upon Lannisport. King Aegon had received confirmation from his uncle Doran, Prince of Sunspear, that the armies of Dorne were sailing for the Westerlands to join the war, but they needed a large port to land all their forces. And so, they had chosen Lannisport. The Battle of Oxcross was a slaughter. Simply because Stafford Lannister hadn't expected an attack inside their own lands, and so no sentries had been established or even defensive positions. And when the cavalry fell upon them in the night, they had no chance of resisting the attack or pushing them back. Ultimately, Stafford Lannister was slain by Lord Ulrich Kelstark of Moat Cailin. Seizing the initiative, Artos Stark decided to not only capture Lannisport, but also Casterly Rock. He knew that if Lannisport came under attack, whilst the defenders would hold the walls, reinforcements from Casterly Rock would march to their aid. And as the gates of the Lion's Mouth opened, they would be charged upon by hidden northern cavalry, and then northern infantry would storm inside, keeping the gates open and allowing their army to charge inside. The plan worked. Whilst the Golden Company attacked Lannisport, the Northern Army captured Casterly Rock. The capture of both Casterly Rock and Lannisport had sent a massive shockwave across all of Westeros, for Casterly Rock had never been taken, and Lan the Clever had only taken it from House Casterly with use of his wits. Not even Aegon the Conqueror could have taken it when he had 3 dragons. Infuriated by the loss of his home, Tywin Lannister made 2 plans to not only gain more men, but also to gain more allies. His first step was to make an ally in the Iron Islands. The second was to force the Stormlands into the war. He learned that Euron Greyjoy, younger brother of Balon Greyjoy, had murdered him and usurped the Lord Paramountcy of the Iron Islands. Not only that, he had crowned himself King Euron III of the Iron Islands. And so he sent an offer of an alliance between them and for him to invade the north. And ever since the murders of her father and uncles, Shireen Baratheon, whom had become regent for her younger brother, ordered for the bannermen of the Stormlands to gather their troops and prepare to defend from an invasion. Especially after a visit from Petyr Baelish, she felt that the Stormlands was under siege from enemies on all sides. She sent her father's most-trusted bannerman, Davos Seaworth, to Essos and find her uncle Algerdus and bring him and Storm Company to the Stormlands. On behalf of the Lannisters, Baelish informed the Baratheons that it was in their best interests to join the war for your cousin, the king. But Shireen refused to, and now, Tywin Lannister was angered that they did not march with their armies for Duskendale. So he sent Mathis Rowan with an army of 30,000 men to the Stormlands to take Storm's End and force the Baratheons to join the war and fight for Joffrey the Illborn. Rowan led his army into the Stormlands, where they occupied the castle of Fellwood, killed Lord Harwood Fell and forced his family into running to Storm's End. Returning to the Riverlands with Aegon's uncle Oberyn and an army of Dornishmen, another surprise came when Oberyn came with a great gift. Recently discovered from where Daeron the young dragon had fallen, Oberyn crowned his nephew with the Valyrian steel crown of Aegon the Conqueror. Still in the north, Eddard and Ashera Stark received a visit from Balon Greyjoy's daughter, Asha, and she informed them of Euron Greyjoy's invasion plans for the north. And it was her intention, for when her kinslaying uncle had died, that her brother Theon would become Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands and would serve Aegon. She informed them that she had the backing of her mother's family of House Harlaw and also House Blacktide. Eddard Stark led an army of 15,000 men to fight the invading Ironborn at the Battle of the Rill Shore. The battle ended when Eddard Stark duelled Euron Greyjoy and killed him with the Stark ancestral sword, Ice, in spite of Euron Greyjoy wearing Valyrian steel armor. Theon was now named Lord Paramount of the Iron Islands. He and his sister Asha led the Iron Fleet to raid and plunder the coastal castles, towns and cities of the Westerlands and the Reach. This diverted the fleets of both the Reach and the Westerlands from protecting King's Landing from a naval attack. Algerdus Baratheon now received the message from his niece, telling him of the murders of his brothers and that Mathis Rowan was in the Stormlands with an army of 30,000 men. Having finished his campaign in the Summer Isles, Algerdus sailed for Storm's End, where the castle was under siege from Mathis Rowan and its harbour was blockaded by a fleet of ships of House Grimm. Algerdus sent a small squadron of fishing boats, set aflame, towards the Grimm ships, to burn them and distract the rest, whilst Algerdus led a small force of 500 men ashore to flank a force of 4,000 men attempting to breach the walls with a ram and with ladders. Though outnumbered 8-1, the men of Storm Company broke into their ranks and crushed the unprepared Reachmen. Algerdus himself had been shot thrice, but took the horse of their fallen commander, Sir Thaddeus Webber, and rode towards Mathis Rowan and his army. He shouted at them and taunted them, demanding that they all face him, and if they didn't, then they were cowards. The men of Mathis Rowan were frightened by the mighty warrior whom fearlessly rode alone in front of them, wounded and shot by 3 arrows. Mathis Rowan was forced to retreat when he saw how frightened his men were and when he saw how many more of Storm Company were landing. With the victory at Storm's End, Algerdus planned to advance further and crush the armies of Rowan and join the war on the Targaryen side, knowing that none would back his nephew to be king and that their only option was to fight to restore House Targaryen. And so, Shireen Baratheon sent Davos Seaworth to Riverrun to bring an important message of swearing fealty to King Aegon. But this grand show of fealty to the rightful king did not just come from the lords of the Stormlands. It also came from Renly Baratheon's bannermen of the Narrow Sea, houses Valerian, Celtigar, Barrowman, Sunglass and Chittering. Davos Seaworth brought the message to King Aegon, promising that House Baratheon would cast aside all claims to the Iron Throne and for all of the Stormlands and the Narrow Sea to fight for King Aegon, and that their armies would join with his when they had crushed Mathis Rowan. King Aegon accepted and sent Davos Seaworth to Storm's End to bring his reply. In Storm's End, Shireen and Fortis Baratheon hosted their bannermen and the bannermen of the Narrow Sea. With the king's acceptance, Algerdus made their plans. He ordered for the lords of the Stormlands to gather their armies whilst he marched Storm Company and the army of Storm's End for Felwood. And whilst he fought Rowan's army, the army of Bronze Eggett, led by Lord Ralph Buckler, would liberate Felwood. Algerdus also ordered for the lords of the Narrow Sea to deal with the fleets of King's Landing. For ever since the Battle of Brindlewood, Tywin Lannister had ensured that all of his reinforcements arrived in Duskendale by sea, whether they were Crown Lands soldiers or sellswords of Essos or Westeros. Montford Valerian was given the command to crush the fleet that was ferrying Tywin Lannister his reinforcements. At the Battle of Felwood, Algerdus led his infantry into the woods and lured the Rowan cavalry towards them, in spite of the woods negating the power of Rowan's cavalry. Whilst the infantry held them back, Algerdus' cavalry took position on a nearby hill, under the command of Algerdus' bastard nephew, Sir Tymond Hill, and Sir Gyard of House Moraigen. On Rowan's command, just as Algerdus had pushed Rowan's cavalry back, he sent his infantry to attack. As they charged towards them, Algerdus gave the command to his own cavalry to flank them. It worked, and within minutes, the cavalry was upon them, crushing Rowan army and forcing him to retreat. The great victory of the Battle of Felwood had guaranteed the Stormlands freed of the armies of the Reach. The Stormlands was now able to join the war on House Targaryen's side and bring King Aegon to the Iron Throne as was his birthright. But when he discovered that Tywin Lannister had 130,000 men in Duskendale, and more arriving every week from sea, he knew that the army of the Stormlands was not enough to fight them if they had joined King Aegon's army. So he sent word to King Aegon telling him that whilst he was going to send Lord Gillian Swan and Lord Lester Moraigen to the Riverlands with 10,000 men, Algerdus was going to lead 40,000 men to Highgarden. Algerdus' plan was to lure away Mace Tyrell and the Reach army from Duskendale and force them to fight him at Highgarden. As well as luring Tyrell away from fighting the king, it also fueled Algerdus' desire for revenge against House Tyrell for all that Mace Tyrell had inflicted upon he and House Baratheon. The king agreed with his plan, and once word had reached Duskendale of Algerdus' movements, Mace Tyrell unhesitatingly left Duskendale with 60,000 men, as well as leaving 15,000 Reachmen behind under the command of his good brother, Sir Baelor Hightower. Mace Tyrell sent his second son, Lord Garland Tyrell of Whitegrove, to Highgarden to lead the garrison and ready them for the coming battle. The Lord of Highgarden had also sent Lord Elwood Meadows of Grassy Vale to go around the Reach and gather as many men as he could to join the fighting at Highgarden against a man, whom the Tyrells knew was the greatest threat to the Reach since their many conflicts with the Dornish. With a fleet of 40 warships, Montford Valerian intercepted the fleet delivering reinforcements to Duskendale. He caught them unawares at the coastlines of Stokeworth and proceeded to board the ships, capturing them rather than destroying them. Lord Valerian had a cunning plan to not only prevent reinforcements from reaching Duskendale, but also to destroy the fleet of Joffrey the Ill-Born in a single fell swoop. He sailed to Blackwater Bay under cover of darkness, and sent a single sloop to the beach of the Mudgate, crewed by Sir Balon Swan and a party of 30 elite knights and soldiers of House Swan. Sir Balon sailed Blackwater Bay, and once ashore, he and his men lowered the great chain protecting the entire harbour, and the 150 warships and 150 transport ships were in full view. Using stockpiles of wildfire stored in Driftmark and Claw Isle, they filled the captured ships with the wildfire and sent them sailing towards the anchored fleet. But Sir Balon proceeded to capture the flagship of Joffrey the Ill-Born, called King Joffrey's Valour, a gift from House Redwyne. The plan went successfully, and all ships but King Joffrey's Valour burned in the Blackwater harbour from the wildfire. Upon hearing the news, Tywin Lannister knew he couldn't wait for the Tyrells to finish with Algerdus at Highgarden. So at last, he left Duskendale and marched an army of 80,000 men towards the Riverlands, where King Aegon also commanded 80,000 men. King Aegon, knowing he was on the move, decided to invite him for talks. Tywin Lannister accepted, and they met at the ruins of Monfriden on the lands of House Mouton of Maidenpool. King Aegon knew that whatever he offered to Tywin Lannister would be refused, and whatever the latter would offer, King Aegon would also refuse. He only wanted the chance to meet his enemy properly, for he had spent his whole life fearing that he would send men to murder his mother, his sister and his aunt. The talks at Monfriden had gone exactly as both sides had predicted, with nothing achieved. King Aegon offered peace in exchange for Tywin Lannister, Cersei Lannister, Joffrey Waters and others to be tried for crimes ranging from treason to murder. And Tywin Lannister offered peace in exchange for Aegon and all his commanders to be exiled into the Night's Watch. When asked why he wanted to meet in the first place, King Aegon replied that he wanted to meet him personally and get the measure of him. Now that he had, he said, "I am disappointed. I thought that lions growl and tear their prey to pieces." Meeting with his commanders in Maidenpool, Lord Mouton told of a suitable land for the battle, one which offered them advantages against the Lannister army. The land was near the village of Redmond. King Aegon marched his army towards Redmond and made his plans to fight Tywin Lannister and his army there. His plan was for he himself to lead the infantry and march to face Tywin's infantry, with a stream of the Bay of Crabs to their north and a wood to their south. But hiding in the wood was the heavy infantry of Last Hearth, commanded by Lord Jon Umber of Last Hearth, placed there to intercept cavalry Tywin Lannister would send to flank them. And far from the battlefield, was the cavalry of King Aegon, commanded by Yohn Royce, Brynden Tully and Oberyn Martell, awaiting Jon Umber's signal that the Lannister cavalry were defeated and it was safe to flank Tywin's army. King Aegon leading and fighting alongside the infantry was an inspiring presence for his men, in evident contrast to Tywin Lannister commanding from his horse at the rear of the battlefield. And he was right, for Tywin Lannister was intent on sending his cavalry to flank from the woods. Though outnumbered 3-1, the infantry of Jon Umber, known as the Great Jon Umber, crushed the cavalry, led by Sir Eddam Marbrand. Sir Eddam himself was defeated by the Lord of Last Hearth, whom wielded his enormous Valyrian steel greatsword Behemoth, believed to be the largest Valyrian steel sword in existence. Upon hearing the war horn of Jon Umber, the cavalry of King Aegon mustered and rode for the battlefield. Once they had reached the woods, they charged across, pincering Tywin Lannister's infantry, archers and his reserves. Prince Oberyn confronted the Lord of Casterly Rock personally, knowing that he was fully responsible for the attempted murders of his sister, his niece and nephew. The infamous Red Viper killed Tywin Lannister with a poisoned spear. With the death of Tywin Lannister the rest of his army had surrendered, and now the road to King's Landing was clear. And at Highgarden, which had been besieged for a week, Mace Tyrell had led 70,000 men to confront Elgaders, whom cut off Highgarden's access to the world by building palisade walls around it, digging trenches, placing sharpened stakes inside and building watchtowers for archers. The defenses Elgaders had built were impressive and stalled Mace Tyrell's plan to attack immediately in a rush to save his home and protect his family. And so, planning with his bannermen, Mace Tyrell decided to attack with all of his troops on their main fortifications, which stood directly across from Highgarden's Rose Gate. And whilst he charged these fortifications, they would come under attack from the other side by Garland Tyrell and the garrison of Highgarden. The plan seemed to work when both armies charged at the main fortifications, whilst being shot at by Baratheon archers. But a sudden surprise came when Mace Tyrell's infantry broke through the gate. Instead of finding soldiers preparing to defend, all that greeted them was a widened path which led from outer palisade gate to the inner palisade gate. And on both sides was palisade walls 15 feet tall and archers shooting at them and dropping rocks and barrels of boiling oil on them. And worse news came for Mace Tyrell's men when they realized that they had marched into a trap. For the infantry of the Stormlands and Storm Company, commanded by Lord Beric Dondarrion and Sir Robin Waters, had marched from other gates and they had formed a semicircle to surround the army of the Reach and prevent their escape. Mace Tyrell's new plan was to break through and escape to Highgarden. But not even this was successful, for once Garland Tyrell had broken through the inner gate and Mace Tyrell and thousands of his bannermen, knights and infantry flooded inside, they came under attack by the cavalry and knights of the Stormlands and Storm Company, led by Elgaders himself and his second-in-command, Sir Bronn of Blackwater. Elgaders charged with the knights of the Stormlands and broke into the ranks of the Reachmen. Elgaders was unmistakable by friend or foe as the famous Stormborn cut down dozens of knights and infantrymen with his Valyrian steel sword and axe, antler and forked fury respectively. But as Algirdas fought his hated enemy, his hatred towards the Reach and House Tyrell only increased when he saw his young nephew, Sir Tor Owain Pike, fall to Randil Tarly. Algirdas charged at the Lord of Hornhill and stabbed him with antler before kicking him in the face. In spite of reaching his nephew, he was infuriated at the death of his nephew and in the heat of his rage, killed many more knights and soldiers before at last, he found the enemy that had starved Storm's End when he was a boy of 5. Algirdas roared and shouted as he charged at Mace Tyrell, killing numerous knights and soldiers as he ran toward him to protect their liege lord from this scourge of the Stormlands. But then he faced Sir Loras Tyrell, one of the finest fighters and jousters of the realm. But not even he could withstand the fury and skill of Algirdas Baratheon, whom disarmed him and knocked him to the ground. But rather than kill the third son, and arguably the favorite son, of Mace Tyrell, Algirdas did not kill him. When asked why by the surprised Knight of Flowers, Algirdas replied, because you were everything to him, referencing his beloved brother Renly. And next, he turned to face Lord Garland Tyrell and his uncles Sir Limer Tyrell and Sir Theodore Tyrell. Whilst Lord Garland is another of the greatest fighters of the realm, his uncles were not and were brutally killed by the furious and vengeful Lord of Summerhall. Lord Garland, though incredibly skilled with his mace, could not best Algirdas Stormborn, whom knocked him to the ground by crushing his pauldron with forked fury, badly wounding his shoulder. Algirdas held up his great axe, ready to kill Garland Tyrell, whilst shouting at Mace Tyrell to watch him kill his son. But as he turned around, he was infuriated to see the Lord of Highgarden attempting to escape the blooded battlefield, where he knew his armies were lost. In a deep rage, Algirdas forgot all about Garland Tyrell and sprinted towards Mace Tyrell just as he had climbed onto a horse. But Algirdas pulled him down from his horse. Refusing to accept a ransom to let he and his sons leave for Highgarden, Algirdas crushed Mace Tyrell's sword to pieces and threw him to the ground. Algirdas clasped his hands around Mace Tyrell's neck, trying to kill him with his own bare hands, whilst shouting at him for all that he had inflicted upon he and his family. But Mace Tyrell was saved when a crossbowman from the walls of Highgarden shot Algirdas Baratheon. Whilst the Lord of Highgarden escaped to Highgarden, the crossbowman had shot Algirdas 5 times before he too was shot by Sir Bronn of Blackwater. The siege of Highgarden remains the bloodiest of all battles in all history of Westeros. At the conclusion of the fighting, 40,000 Reachmen had died and 5,000 Stormlanders and sellswords of Storm Company had been killed in the fighting. The battle is ofttimes remembered as Dark Day by the small folk of the Reach. In spite of being shot 5 times, Algirdas Baratheon had survived. Whilst the Tyrells pondered on what do next now that their army was crushed and many of their bannermen were taken prisoner, events unfolded in King's Landing, where the city had been captured by King Aegon, whom had been helped in this endeavour by Lord Tyrion Lannister, Lord Varys, Lord Willers Tyrell and Sir Jacelyn Bywater when they had realised that there was nothing that could hold them back. And a week after the fighting, Mace Tyrell met with Algirdas under a flag of truce at the Rose Gate. The hate-driven Lord of Summerhall met with the Lord of Highgarden and told him that the siege continues until Highgarden falls. But it was not to be so. Fortunately for the Tyrells, salvation had come in the form of Sir Robar Royce, a knight of King Aegon's Kingsguard, whom had come as a messenger on behalf of the king. He delivered the news of the fall of King's Landing and the Battle of Redmond to both sides and that the king wanted all nobility of the Stormlands and the Reach to be in the Red Keep to swear fealty to the king in person. Though angered that he couldn't take his revenge further, Algirdas accepted the king's orders and lifted the siege. Trials were held for Cersei Lannister, Joffrey the Ill-Born and Petyr Baelish. Cersei Lannister was charged with orchestrating the murder of Robert Baratheon, incest and usurpation. Joffrey Waters was charged with the murders of hundreds of small folk for his own grotesque amusement, ordering the murders of bastard children of Robert Baratheon and usurpation of the Iron Throne. And Petyr Baelish was charged with embezzlement, theft of money of the royal treasury and the murders of Jon Arryn, Stannis Baratheon and Renly Baratheon. All 3 were found guilty and sentenced to death, though Baelish demanded a trial by combat. As if to prove his guilt even further, he had named Gerald Dane and Lyn Corbray as his champions. Algirdas accepted the challenge and fought the men whom murdered his brothers. He very easily, but brutally, killed the 2 champions of Petyr Baelish. He buried forked fury into the groin of Gerald Dane before splitting his head in half with it. And he sliced the legs off of Corbray with antler before he impaled Corbray's brains with antler by stabbing him through the mouth. It is said that this show of brutality was a warning to all potential enemies of House Baratheon that though they were no longer kings, they were still a power to be reckoned with, especially with Algirdas Baratheon. The 3 defendants were promptly executed in the Dragon Pit. Sir Jaime Lannister, the Kingslayer, in spite of killing his grandfather, was granted mercy and permitted to serve in the Night's Watch before the king officially announced an end to the conflict that had so plagued the Seven Kingdoms for over a year and cost the lives of 150,000 soldiers and sailors and 10,000 small folk of the Riverlands, the Stormlands and the Reach. And in the throne room, King Aegon announced a few great changes to the Seven Kingdoms. The first included the separation of the capital from the Crown Lands and for the Crown Lands to be renamed the Dragonlands and to be ruled from Dragonstone. King's Landing became a separate entity, like a free city in Essos, and bastards of King's Landing with noble heritage are referred to as Wood, derived from the King's Wood outside the city. Another involved the Small Council, which the king thought was too small to handle the tasks of administering the Seven Kingdoms and its people. So he disbanded the Small Council and formed the Great Council, creating new positions to it to better administer the Seven Kingdoms. He also increased the number of the King's Guard from 7 to 13. Finally, the Golden Company was disbanded. John Connington had served under the king as Hand of the King and Harry Strickland was named Lord of Dunstanbury by the king. And the king announced his intentions to wed his childhood love, Lyanna Stark, to the nobility of the realm. The two were wed a week later and crowned king and queen by the High Septon in the Great September of Baelor. Together they have had 7 children: Crown Prince Aethys, Princess Valeera, Prince Balon, Princess Rulla, Prince Daeron, Princess Elena and Prince Jaehaerys. Outlawing the doctrine of exceptionalism, King Aegon and Queen Lyanna decreed for there to never again be incest practiced between the children of House Targaryen. This pleased the High Septon and the faith of the Seven, for they had been displeased that the king and queen both had grown up worshipping the old gods, though both had promised that their children would be raised following the faith of the Seven. Algirdas Baratheon has since stepped down from his role as founder and captain of Storm Company. His bastard nephew, Sir Robin, is currently captain of Storm Company. It seems that since the disbandment of the Golden Company, Storm Company has risen up to the challenge and replaced it as the most feared, respected and powerful sellsword company in the known world. Storm Company was last heard fighting in the lands of Always Summer, conquering them on behalf of a Valyrian warlord called Vigor Galenios. Algirdas now rules Summerhall, taking the name Baratheon, with his lady wife Bellenora Summers of the Summer Isles and their children Caloyan and Sylana. To prevent any potential infighting amongst his children and to ensure House Targaryen held strong alliances with the realm, King Aegon awarded Princes Daemon and Jaehaerys the lordships of the newly restored castles of Oldstones and Castamere. Prince Balon now rules the Dragonlands from Dragonstone as Lord Paramount. Princess Valeera was married to Axel Tully, heir to Riverrun and son of Edmure Tully and Margaery Tyrell. Princess Rulla was wed to Caron Greyjoy, heir to Pike and son of Theon Greyjoy and Roslyn Frey. And Princess Elena was wed to Loron Lannister, son of Tommen Lannister and Jane Westerling. Due to House Baratheon making more enemies than friends in the war, Myrcella Lannister was wed to Lord Fortis Baratheon when both came of age. Though thanks to the many friends and allies Algirdas Baratheon had made whilst captain of Storm Company, the economy of the Stormlands grew with trading agreements made between the Stormlands and the free cities of Volantis and Pentos, the Kingdom of the Summer Isles and the Kingdom of Basilisk Bay. Chapter 73, Epilogue. Chapter Text. Larissa Tyrell, Sinv Coulson. We love period drama source Sinov Coulson as Clarisse. Whom is jousting now? Larissa asked. It's Uncle Loras against Lord Commander Royce, said Melaina. Larissa and her younger sister watched as Uncle Loras jousted against the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. It was the final day of the tourney welcoming the King, the Queen and Crown Prince Aethys to Highgarden. Since their coronation, they would make a visit to the capital of one of the Seven Kingdoms. Last year had been to Casterly Rock. And now it was Highgarden. Looking around the tourney grounds, Larissa found it difficult to believe that such a horrible and devastating battle such as Dark Day was fought on these grounds, and where Algirdas the Scourge killed thousands of Reachmen, including Grandfather Randil, and wounded Uncle Garlan and Uncle Loras and tried to murder Grandfather. It had been said that even after the dead were booked and buried, one could still step in the blood of the dead weeks after the battle. Larissa and Melaina clapped when they saw Uncle Loras ride onto the tourney grounds, followed by the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Both bowed to King Egon and Queen Eleanor whilst Crown Prince Aethys was absent from the royal stands, for he was getting prepared to joust against the victor. Larissa nervously watched as Uncle Loras rode to the end of the lists and turned around to face his Lord Commander. "You'll always be my hero, Uncle Loras. Whether you win or lose." Larissa had grown up in adoration of Uncle Loras and his reputation as the Knight of the Flowers. The buglers played a note and Uncle Loras rode hard towards the Lord Commander of the Kingsguard. Larissa stood up and applauded and cheered for Uncle Loras as he remained sat on his horse whilst Robarois was unhorsed. "And now he faces my betrothed," Larissa thought as she watched Uncle Loras ride to his tent to prepare for facing the Crown Prince. The night before, Larissa had been brought before the King, Queen and Crown Prince in Grandfather Solar where the Crown Prince offered his hand in marriage. She shyly accepted, surprised by the offer. Father and Mother smiled encouragingly at her and reassured her that all would be well whilst Grandfather Mace and Grandmother Aeleri beamed proudly at her, as though this was the best day of their lives. Melina was betrothed now to Doran Baratheon, in a match arranged to heal relations between House Baratheon and House Tyrell. However, many of the Reach nobility were angered by the match, saying it was an insult to the memories of the thousands of dead slain by the Baratheons on Dark Day. Larissa watched as Aethys climbed onto his horse and took his lance from his squire, Galbafrey. He rode to the royal stands and bowed his head to his parents. Aethys was so handsome. His silver Valyrian hair reached down to the center of his neck and he was as muscular and as strong as his uncle, Sir Brandon Stark. But what Larissa enjoyed the most about him was his sense of honor and his humility. Whilst most knights and nobles she had met would do an act of chivalry and expect a round of applause or recognition for their actions. But Aethys did not. He was considerate and did not care for over-exaggerated shows of chivalry or for gratitude and recognition for it. Something which father suspected was due to his Stark heritage from his mother's side. Uncle Loras rode before the stands and bowed his head to the king and queen before they rode to their places. Larissa looked at the lance Aethys used. It was made of ironwood. She recognized the colors from the woods father would import from the north, likely supplied by Sir Asher Forrester's family. The buglers played a grand note, likely as a final piece for the final joust of the tourney. Larissa clapped as Uncle Loras and Aethys charged at each other. Larissa watched how Aethys' powerful lance knocked Uncle Loras from his horse, his lance fallen on the soil before he did. Larissa stood in surprise as Uncle Loras struggled to get up. She breathed a sigh of relief when Uncle Loras removed his helm and laughed as he did so. "Thank the gods, that had me worried," Larissa thought. Larissa clapped for Aethys when he climbed down from his horse and helped Uncle Loras stand up. As Larissa expected when she and the audience clapped for him, he did not bask in the adulation and leonization. He just asked Uncle Loras if he needed to see a maester. I can just imagine Denise Hightower or Roland Rowan waving and grinning like idiots whilst helping their defeated opponents up. The tourney master loudly announced, "My king and queen, my lords and ladies and esteemed guests, the victor of the tourney is Sir Aethys of House Targaryen, the Crown Prince." Larissa remained standing as she clapped for Aethys' victory and show of chivalry towards Uncle Loras. Aethys climbed back onto his horse and was passed another lance by his free squire before Grandfather placed a crown of roses on the tip of his lance. Aethys looked around and made a beeline for Larissa. Is he truly going to crown me? He thrusted his lance in her direction and the crown of roses fell onto her lap. As Larissa placed the crown on her head, Aethys raised his lance and cleared his throat gently and quietly. "My lords and ladies, it is with great honor that I announced my betrothal to the lovely and charming Lady Larissa of House Tyrell," he said proudly. The audience clapped, though Larissa noticed that none clapped nearly as loudly as her grandparents or her parents. "This is it. I am to be his queen," she thought. The end.